The ceasefire deadline in the Iran war is set to expire in just 2 days on April 22nd, and the Strait of Hormuz appears to have emerged as the most critical choke point, quite literally. As the world was hoping for some good news in 2 days, what followed instead was a major escalation. The U.S. Navy seized an Iranian vessel, Tosca, in the Gulf of Oman. Donald Trump claims the ship was given fair warning to stop, but according to him, the crew refused to listen, after which U.S. forces stopped them right in their tracks by blowing a big hole in the engine room. The U.S. president's words, not mine. With tensions rising, questions now loom over the future of peace talks. Tehran has indicated it has absolutely no plans to join the next round of discussions in Pakistan, even as Washington moves ahead with its delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance. In fact, this is breaking news coming in. Vice President J.D. Vance and the U.S. delegation, which has Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner as part of it, are en route to Islamabad for these peace talks and are expected to land within hours. Speaking to U.S. media, President Donald Trump is saying that talks are still on track, dismissing concerns of a breakdown. He's asserting nobody is playing games, signaling confidence that negotiations will go ahead. Trump has also indicated that he's open to meeting senior Iranian leaders personally if a breakthrough is achieved, raising the stake for what could be a key diplomatic moment. Naam kaun hai? Banda kaun? Advisor. All right, let me go straight across to our guest joining us this evening. Ali Vaez is director of the Iran project and senior advisor at the Crisis Group. Ali, thank you very much for your time. Here we have J.D. Vance already on his way to Islamabad, but Iran, at least for the moment, is saying no to talks. They're saying they are not showing up in Tehran. Why?
The reason the Iranians are reluctant to go back to the negotiating table is that President Trump has kept his naval blockade of Iranian oil shipments. And in fact, the U.S. has just seized an Iranian tanker. If the Iranians go to Islamabad under the current circumstances, it would appear that they have been coerced back to the negotiating table. And that is something that the Iranians are just simply allergic to, being seen in a position of weakness or negotiating with a gun to their head.
Ali, I understand the allergy, but honestly, what option does Iran have than to go back to the talking table?
Well, diplomacy without coercion is the only option. I think the only solution to get back to the negotiating table is for both sides to remove the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, based on the ceasefire arrangement and understanding that they had less than 2 weeks ago. Returning to those circumstances would allow a return to the diplomatic table, and that's just the beginning of a very hard process of trying to bridge the gaps, get to some sort of a framework understanding, and then from there start tackling these issues one by one. These are often extremely complicated, technical, and politically sensitive issues. So it's going to take some time to reach an agreement, but this, despite the effort and the difficulty, is so much better compared to the alternative.
We've just heard from President Trump, who's told reporters that the negotiations are still very much on track. Now, I don't know whether President Trump is living in a parallel universe or he knows something more than we do, but is there still a possibility that Iran, despite saying no, can still change its mind and fly to Islamabad tomorrow?
The only scenario in which I see Iran returning to Islamabad is a scenario in which President Trump has loosened or ended the U.S.'s naval blockade of Iran. There is no other scenario in which the Iranians will go to Islamabad, because they also believe that if they do so under coercion, the deal that the U.S. is going to put on the table or agree to is not a deal that is favorable to them. So that's the only way. And if they don't have an agreement by Wednesday, which is the date of the expiry of the 2-week ceasefire, then there is a real risk of returning to a conflict that can escalate very quickly and even spiral out of control.
All right. If the Iranians do come to the talking table, you're talking about the naval blockade of Hormuz. Is that the big sticking point, according to you? Or are there multiple sticking points, like enriched uranium and, Iran's possible nuclear armament?
Look, the question of Iran's future of Iran's nuclear program has been on the table for a long time, and there's been perennial differences over Iran's right to enrichment and whether Iran can have a domestic nuclear fuel cycle. But that doesn't mean that both sides were reluctant to get to the table. They were at the table before. The problem is that the United States, twice in the course of less than a year, bombed Iran in the middle of negotiations. This is why if the Iranians are to go to the table and stay at the table, they have to make sure that the US has realized that coercion, whether it's military or economic, is simply not going to soften Iran's position. If that happens, then they can stay at the table and continue negotiating until they have a deal that is mutually acceptable. But now I think the biggest question is, will they get back to the table before the ceasefire expires?
While the world and Iran have blamed President Trump for his flip-flops, look at Iran's flip-flop on Hormuz as well. At one point, it's open. Then it's open only for Iranians. Then it is open, but it is not open. We are not quite sure. And now it is open for no one.
Well, I would say it appears that the Iranian inconsistency is a reflection of American inconsistency. Look, the terms of the ceasefire were clear. That Iran would open traffic to the Strait based on the conditions that it had put in place, which is that that vessels would have to pass through Iran's territorial waters, not the international waterway, and be controlled by Iran, who's not going to allow vessels associated with the United States and Israel to pass through. This agreement was supposed to come into force. The Iranians announced it only for President Trump to say he wants to keep his blockade in place. And so then the Iranians walked back their opening of the Strait, and they have now imposed their own blockade. The reality is, if a ceasefire is reestablished or extended based on the initial terms, I think the Iranians would allow a controlled opening of the Straits. But that requires for them to be able to also benefit from this opening, which means that the US blockade also needs to come off.
But Ali, Iranians also want to tax every ship that is passing through Hormuz, and that is something that the US has a problem with.
Absolutely. So from the US perspective, the Strait is either open for everyone or closed for everyone. And either there's a collective mechanism for charging transit fees, or there is no mechanism for charging transit fees. So this is a subject of negotiation, because the Iranian view is that there's no one who's going to pay them reparations for this war that has inflicted tremendous damage on the country's infrastructure. And therefore, if the US is unwilling to provide Iran with substantive, concrete, verifiable sanctions relief, the Iranians see the toll system in the Strait as the only mechanism they can generate revenue for reconstruction. So I would argue the more the US offers economic incentives to Iran, the less the Iranians would need the Strait as a mechanism to generate revenue for recovery from this war. There is also another alternative, which is some sort of a consortium that brings both sides of the Gulf together, Iran and the GCC, maybe with involvement of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, with permission from the UN Security Council, to establish a temporary mechanism for charging tolls for the region's recovery from this war. So I think there are solutions, diplomatic solutions to this challenge, but it really requires a cooperative spirit at the negotiating table to find mutually beneficial outcomes, not that one side dictates its solutions to the other.
That is if Iran does show up at the peace table. There has also been some talk, in some sections at least, about differences or infighting in the Iranian leadership. Now, is this, according to you, simply psyops by the Americans, or is this something that is rooted in reality?
I don't see any sign of serious infighting within the Iranian system. This is still a system that is fighting for its survival and therefore doesn't have enough bandwidth to also engage in infighting. There are obviously always different voices in Iran. That is not a new phenomenon. But I see more cohesion in a system that has been battered so much by the US and Israel. 450 senior Iranian leaders, military and political, have been eliminated since the 12-day war last year. And yet the system has preserved its coherence and it's making decisions in a consensual manner. And if there are mixed messages coming out of Iran, it is because they are reacting to U.S. zigzagging all the time. But I don't see anyone freelancing, anyone trying to really fundamentally undermine the position of any other part of the system. There is, however, an effort within Iran to try to justify the need for compromise with the United States, which has just attacked Iran and killed its leadership and inflicted so much damage on the country, threatened to end Iranian civilization. There is a need for the regime to justify the need for compromise to its own core constituents. And so this is why you see Iranian leaders going on state television and trying to explain why, although they have the upper hand from their perspective at the battlefield, they would have to compromise at the negotiating table, because at the end of the day, they cannot defeat much more superior military powers like the United States and Israel.
Ali, we'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you very much for joining us at this hour, an hour where there is still a question on whether Iran will actually join these peace talks. President Trump seems to believe that negotiations are on track. J.D. Vance is on his way to Islamabad. What happens if Tehran doesn't show up? So far, for the moment, Tehran is saying they are not coming for the talks, but who knows? Much could change in the next couple of hours. We'll keep a track of that.